Welcome. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm your host today, Daniel Davis, and thank you for joining us. We've got a marvelous show ahead for you that might even get your blood boiling a little bit. As we're approaching a new election year, there are many calendars out there that are wishing away our former leader of 8 years, George W. Bush, but the question now becomes, what does his life do after the so-called mess that he's made here in America? Well, one of the most promising things that could be occurring on the horizon is the possibility that he could be facing charges for murder. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is Vincent Bugliosi. He was the former Los Angeles County District Attorney who successfully prosecuted 105 out of 106 felony jury trials, including 21 murder convictions without a single loss. His most famous trial, most people might be familiar with, is the one of Charles Manson, which became the basis of his classic Helter Skelter. We also had him on the Beyond 50 radio program. I believe it was roughly about a year ago where we were talking with him about his newest book at the time, which was Reclaiming History, the Assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And he has been one of the most successful, if not the most successful, true crime writers in American history, having at least 3 #1 New York Times bestsellers on the list in true crime. His new book that we're going to talk about today is something that might stir a little bit of controversy, if you will, and it's simply titled The Prosecution of George W. Bush for Murder. And joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program, I'd like to welcome Vincent Bugliosi. And Vincent, thank you for joining us this morning on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Happy to be on the show, Daniel. There was one word that was not correct. You said the persecution of George Bush for murder. It's the prosecution.
Prosecution. Excuse persecution. Yeah, you know, sometimes you get these morning interviews and you slip a word. But, see, I've been learning that from our government, actually, over the last 20 or 30 years. You know, it's just all about slighting, you know, and so forth. Now, Vincent, I read the book cover to cover, and it was, you know, I had plenty of time, and then we've been able to sit with it. One thing that comes obvious is that you really just don't like George W. Bush.
Yeah, I think it's beyond that. I have an enormous animus to him, for him. Not only the fact that the evidence is clear, as I point out in my book, The Prosecution of Bush for Murder, that he took this nation to war on a lie, under false pretenses, and therefore, under the law, he's guilty of murder for the deaths of over 4,000 young American soldiers who have died so far fighting his war in Iraq. And Daniel, let's not forget about the over 100,000, and that's a very low estimate, very conservative estimate. Some people place the number at over 1 million. The over 100,000 innocent Iraqi men, women, children, and babies who have died horrible, violent deaths because of this man's war. But it's not just that. It's the fact that the evidence is overwhelming, cannot be disputed, incontrovertible, that while young American soldiers, Daniel, we're talking about 18, 19-year-old kids who never had a chance to live out their dreams, were being blown to pieces by roadside bombs in Iraq. This guy, George Bush, smiled through it all. I'm talking about things like bicycling and running and joking around and slapping backs and dancing and swiveling his hips like Elvis to blaring music and having his hot dogs and blueberry pie, and almost always seeming to be in the very best of good spirits. And your audience doesn't have to take my word for it, or the photos that you saw in the book, Daniel, that show him during the war just having a ball. Bush himself has had no hesitancy in saying things like this right in the midst of all the horror and the death and the suffering going on over there. Laura and I are having the time of our lives. I'm in a great mood. It's going to be a perfect day. I'm feeling pretty good about life. Here's someone, Daniel, that whose war has cost this nation over $1 trillion so far, with no end in sight. He's virtually destroyed an entire nation, the nation of Iraq. And again, the most important thing, because it bears repeating, he's criminally responsible for over 4,000 young American soldiers being in their graves and well over 100,000 innocent Iraqi people dying horrible deaths. And he says he's feeling pretty good about life. Daniel, even if George Bush was only guilty of making an innocent mistake in taking this nation to war, not murder, as I firmly believe, in view of all the death, horror, and suffering he has caused, what type of a monstrous individual is it who could be happy with his life? And long answer to your question, I have a tremendous animosity for this man, and I'm not going to be satisfied. I may not succeed until I see him in an American courtroom being prosecuted for first-degree murder. And if the jury convicts him, then it'll be up to them to decide the appropriate punishment. One of their options being the imposition of the death penalty. I told the House Judiciary Committee when I testified back there on July 25th that at this stage of my career, I don't have time for fanciful reveries. I never in a million years would propose a murder prosecution of George Bush if I didn't feel there was more than enough evidence to convict him and that I was standing on very strong legal ground.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know that in your book, too, is that you lay out the casework, so to speak, that it doesn't matter where he's at in the United States because every state in our union has lost someone to the war. And this can be something that can happen any time in his life. It doesn't have to happen tomorrow, but it could happen 10, 15, even 30 years from now. But the point is that it could happen should you find a DA with a spine, if you will, who's willing to take on this task.
Yeah, I'm looking for that DA right now. In fact, just a couple days ago, I was out of town. I was at the Democratic convention up in Denver, but I just got a list from the National Association of District Attorneys in Alexandria, Virginia, of all the DAs around the country and their addresses. I was under the erroneous impression that there were about 1,000 elected or appointed DAs. The number is 2,700. And I don't think it's unreasonable to believe that there's at least one prosecutor out there who has the sufficient courage, and maybe many more, to step forward and say, hey, this is the United States of America. In America, no man is above the law, and I'm going to go after Bush and bring about justice for the American people. And as you were pointing out, Daniel, there's no statute of limitations for the crime of murder. Pinochet down in Chile, 33 years later, they brought murder charges against him, and his death aborted the prosecution. But I've established jurisdiction in my book for a great number of prosecutors on a state level, as opposed to the DA, who's on a county level. I've established jurisdiction for the Attorney General in each of the 50 states, plus, as I just indicated, the district attorneys in about 2,700 district attorneys in counties within those states to prosecute Bush for the murder of any soldier or soldiers from their state or county who died fighting Bush's war in Iraq. Federally, we're really only talking about one prosecutor, the Attorney General in Washington, D.C., operating through the Department of Justice. The reason I say only one is that there are 93 U.S. attorneys around the country, but there's no likelihood at all that they would prosecute Bush without first getting the consent of their boss in Washington, D.C. So federally, we're only talking about one prosecutor, but on a state and local level, the number is extremely high. And if you were to ask me the likelihood of this happening, I would say there's probably not a high probability, but I absolutely believe that as a direct result of this book, prosecution of George W. Bush for murder, there's a substantial possibility that he's going to end up someday in an American courtroom being prosecuted for murder. And the main reason, as we've already alluded to, is the great number of prosecutors that have established jurisdiction for.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also contended, too, that there's also the possibility of Dick Cheney being involved in this as well as Condoleezza Rice. Is that possible as well, or is this guy going to basically be standing on his own?
Oh, no. Okay. They may end up testifying against him as a result.
Yeah, because we know they wouldn't protect; they'd protect themselves. That's what we do know for sure. So.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. These are immoral or perhaps even amoral people, and if they were willing to deceive the country on matters of war and peace, certainly they're not going to have the loyalty to Bush to stand up there and go to the gas chamber. If the DA offers them a plea bargain, and he wouldn't do it if he didn't think he could convict them without a plea bargain. But if he offers them a plea bargain and offers life imprisonment as opposed to the death penalty, then they probably would end up testifying against Bush. But there's no question that Bush did not take this nation to war by himself. Mm-hmm. Unquestionably, there was a conspiracy, and the two co-conspirators clearly would be Condoleezza Rice and Dick Cheney. Rove is probably in it over his head. Rumsfeld, I'm not 100% sure of. Powell, I have the sense that his only sin was weakness, but this would all come out if there was a grand jury convened by a state or local prosecutor. There'd be testimony, there'd be witnesses testifying. There would be the subpoenaing of documents. It's called a subpoena ducis tecum. We'd get documents that the federal government would not be able to withhold. Many of these documents are no longer even classified. There'd be an investigation, interviews outside of court, and we don't know what would surface. But there's no question that if I come aboard as a special prosecutor or even as an advisor, that we'll be going after Bush, Cheney, and Rice at an absolute minimum. There's a conspiracy here.
Yeah, Vincent, it's interesting because one of the big questions that I always had on my mind, and it was something that I was curious about, and sometimes, as you say in your book, and it's stated absolute fact, is that the first, I guess if you will, the first casualty of war is truth, and to me it seems the second one becomes common sense. Now, you take a look back at the Clinton administration, and you brought this up in your book, and I thought, God, somebody else who actually seen the same thing I did is when Ken Starr pulled the kind of garbage that he did, you know, going after this witch hunt about something that the Clintons allegedly did 8 years before he was in office. That how's this guy able to do what he's doing with millions of dollars of taxpayer money, and in the end he comes up with nothing, and then there's no accountability for that. So now we go ahead and we fast forward to the Bush administration. We take a look at the fact that what we were supposed to have was a war on terror. In the beginning, it was about going after bin Laden. All the news was about going into Afghanistan. There was a lot of cooperation on many fronts for us to go in there and successfully do this, pull them out of there, and do what we were supposed to do. And then it shifted to Iraq, and I thought to myself, I don't remember us really ever having a problem with that country. And all of a sudden now it's Saddam Hussein and Iraq and weapons of mass destruction. And as you talk about in your book, George Bush wanted to go to war. And for some reason, when you take a look at even any of his speeches, along with his host of, for instance, Dick Cheney and Condoleezza Rice, they kind of sit in the background, but he actually looks like he wants to do it. And then you talk about the UN inspections. They were finding there wasn't much of anything there. Iraq was fully cooperating. But for some reason, we just had to push and push until we went into war. And as anybody would study any kind of history, relatively speaking, unless you were a raving lunatic, most leaders don't want to go to war. They want to kind of figure out a way that they can settle this. But in this case, that wasn't true.
Yeah, well, you've articulated everything very well, and you've covered many issues. I don't know which one to even start talking about.
It's about wanting him to go, that he wanted to go to Iraq to go to war. I don't understand what was the purpose for us to go to Iraq, you know, and to fight a war in Iraq.
Well, now you've raised yet another issue as to what his motive was, and I can't tell you what his motive was. I can tell you what he said his motive was. He made it very, very clear that he said that Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, therefore he was an imminent threat to security of this country, so we have to go over there and strike in self-defense. We have to strike first. But many people, as you know, Daniel, have not accepted that. They feel that there were other reasons, such as oil, politics. Even some suggest a family drama going on between the Bushes. That Bush was trying to upstage his father. Mm-hmm. But I do want to make one point clear, because many lay people are unaware of it. They think that the prosecutor has to prove motive as his burden. Mm-hmm. Motive is not an element of the corpus delicti of any crime. I've put people on death row without knowing precisely for sure why, the motive for their killing the victim. All I knew is that the victim was in his or her grave, and there was no legal justification for doing it. I can tell you this, whatever Bush's motive was, it was no good. But you've covered so many other things there. You were comparing Clinton with Bush.
Well, no, it wasn't Clinton that I was comparing. The point I was comparing was
Clinton,
the fact
but what they
that
did to Clinton.
that you had Ken Starr just deciding he's going to go do something. So you're having these people basically not being accountable to anybody, doing whatever it is they feel that they want to do, and how we're allowing that to happen in the first place, I guess, is what I was drawing the comparison to.
You're right. You weren't talking about Clinton per se, but about what they did to him. Yeah, well, there have been millions of words, critical, harsh, condemnatory words uttered against Bush in the last 7 years, none of which he could care any less about because they're just words. But up until now, other than talk, no one has done anything at all to George Bush. No impeachment, not even an investigation of him, nothing. But in my book, I put together a legal case that could result in his being prosecuted for first-degree murder in an American courtroom. I set forth the legal architecture to go after him, the evidence of his guilt. And by the way, Daniel, I hope we have some time to get into some of that evidence, and the jurisdiction to prosecute him. But there's no one doing anything to Bush. Clinton, who did nothing at all, had consensual sex outside of marriage, tried to cover it up. And my God, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, the mainstream media savaged him, including the so-called liberal New York Times and Washington Post. The monstrous, grotesque Ken Starr set out to destroy the Clinton presidency, almost succeeded. And Daniel, this effort of his was funded. Let me repeat, funded. This 7-year, $70 million effort was funded by the United States government. Clinton was impeached, almost driven from office. They wanted to hang him from the town square at noontime. And here we have Bush taking the nation to war on a lie, and as many as 1 million people are in their graves today because of it, and no one is doing anything at all to George Bush. It's enough to make the cat cry, but I can tell you that I'm out there looking around this country for a courageous prosecutor, and don't be surprised if I find him. And you pick up the paper, and that some prosecutor up in Fargo, North Dakota, has filed murder charges against Bush. He cannot be permitted to get by with murder. So far, he and his people have gotten by with thousands upon thousands of murders, and we, America, the American people, cannot let him do this.
Well, not only that, too, Vincent, I guess the point I was making is I believe I came clear is that we began to see a government, and it's been going for quite some time, where they just feel they can do whatever they want to do, regardless of what anybody thinks, and then they believe they're above the law, that in the end of the day they're going to wake up in the morning, they're going to have their pancakes and their sausages, and it's just another day. And what's interesting about that is the fact that, that George Bush decided to go. Now, here's what's really interesting. I was talking with someone a couple of weeks ago, and I had mentioned that I was going to be talking with you, and that this was the premise that I was going to be talking with you about. And he just kind of rolled his head, and he says, look, George Bush was a fine governor in the state of Texas. He's doing the best job that he can. What's interesting is that there are American people that feel that we are and that he is doing the right thing, and I don't understand that thinking.
Well, who are these people? They're the right wing in this country, a terrible group of people. When I grew up in America, they always had the right wing, but they were on the fringes, and they were an embarrassment to Republican presidents like Eisenhower, Nixon, Ford, even the first George Bush. But now these people have taken over the country, and I'm telling you, they've transformed this country into a nation, Daniel, where many people, for the first time ever, do not feel 100% confident and safe living in America. I trace all this stuff. I can't be sure, but I trace what's happening to the right wing. And if someone says, "Well, come on," I think I can using the Socratic method, show you that it probably is the right wing by one simple question. What do you think, Daniel, would happen to Bill Clinton if he had done the same identical thing that George Bush did, took this nation to war in Iraq under a lie? They would be skinning him alive. The left wing in this country is terrified of the right. The right has no fear of the left. And I think that's probably the main reason why, I don't know if you're aware of, are you aware that this book, The Prosecution of Bush for Murder, has been virtually blacked out by the entire mainstream media?
Yeah, it was actually told to me by the producer it was, but it seemed that people outside of the country, the United States, are interested.
Well, they're interested here. I never had any trouble getting the book published. I've had 3 that got up to #1 in the New York Times. No other American writer has had more than 1 in true crime. Just a couple of months ago, I won for a record-breaking 3rd time the Edgar Allan Poe Award for Best True Crime Book of the Year, Reclaiming History, a book of the assassination. It's now being made into a 10-hour miniseries by Tom Hanks and his people for HBO. So I've never, ever had any trouble getting the book published. This book, Daniel, I had a very difficult time getting it published. For the first time, I had to go back east, knock on doors. It was obvious they were frightened. Frightened of whom? Well, if it's not the right wing, then who? They'd say things like this to me: Mr. Bugliosi, are you sure you want to publish this book? One of them put it in black and white, too hot to handle. I finally found a courageous publisher. Now we go down to the audio level. Never gave it a thought before. This time I get a call from my agent. Vince, I cannot find an audio company in America that's willing to do the audio on this book. We had to get the BBC to do it. Right now, as I'm talking to you, it's in post-production, a documentary for the big screen based on my book. The producers couldn't raise 1 penny in America for the documentary. The money had to come in from Canada. On the publicity for the book, with all my other true crime books, automatically, didn't even think about it, went back to New York City, and you start out the book tour on national television.
Right.
This time I did not go back to New York City. I couldn't get on one national network or cable TV show. Not one newspaper to this day has reviewed the book. My publicist has been in the business for over 30 years, said she has never seen a blackout of a book like this. It got so bad, Daniel, that, listen to this, ABC Radio refused to accept money from my publisher to take out a radio spot, an advertisement on ABC Radio. And we're supposed to be the land of the free, home of the brave. You know, our most cherished constitutional right is freedom of speech and expression. No man is above the law. And all these other constitutional principles and pillars upon which this nation is supposedly built. Maybe I'm overstating it, but I don't think this would happen to a book like mine. And I'm an established writer, not some kook. I don't think this would happen today. Maybe I'm wrong. In England or any European country except Putin's Russia. This is the United States of America. Now, you also know that despite this blackout, the book is a New York Times bestseller. It's been on the bestseller list for 7 weeks. And why? Well, it's because of people like you, Daniel, that are having me on the show, and the book has gotten tremendous word of mouth. But this blackout, what does that say about America? I think it's a sad commentary.
Well, it's pretty obvious what it says about America. It says that we just don't believe in giving the right information to people anymore. Now, I would like to, let's talk about the evidence that you wanted to get to, and we do have a little bit of time that we can cover some of this. So people have a clear understanding that who I'm talking with today isn't somebody who self-published a book on the Internet, but this is somebody who, as you've just basically laid out, has tremendous credibility and understanding not only the law, but also had great success in publishing true crime books who people know of. So let's talk about the evidence in the prosecution of George W. Bush for murder and how that all lays out and plays out.
Okay, there are several legal complexities in this case, all of which I discuss in depth in the book. But because of time constraints, let me tell you the main legal issue at the trial, if Bush were ever prosecuted. The main legal issue is whether or not George Bush took this nation to war in self-defense, as he claimed, his so-called preemptive strike. Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. He was an imminent threat, so we had to strike first in self-defense. If legal defense were established at Bush's trial, then all of the killings of American soldiers in Iraq would become what they call legally justifiable. However, if the prosecutor could prove that Bush did not take this nation to war in self-defense, but under false pretenses, on a lie, then all of the deaths of American soldiers, all of the killings of American soldiers in Iraq would become unlawful killings and therefore murder. So the key issue at the trial, and there are many other sophisticated issues, is whether or not Bush took the nation to war in self-defense. Let me give you some of the evidence. There's much more in the book. that proves that Bush did not take this nation to war in self-defense, but under lie. I have documentary evidence. And by the way, for whatever reason, what I'm about to tell you has never appeared in any major newspaper or magazine in America. Why, I don't know. Probably just pure incompetence. I have documentary evidence that when George Bush told the nation on the evening of October the 7th, 2002, from Cincinnati, Ohio, that Hussein was an imminent threat to the security of this country, he was telling millions of unsuspecting Americans the exact opposite of what his own CIA had told him just 6 days earlier in a classified top-secret report on October the 1st, that Hussein was not an imminent threat to the security of this country, that he would only be a threat if he feared an imminent attack on him by us. In other words, he'd only be a threat if he were forced to fight in self-defense. And it gets worse. October 4th, 3 days later, the Bush administration put out an unclassified summary version of this classified report so they could give it to Congress and the American people. In fact, Congress, just 7 days later, was scheduled to vote on whether or not to authorize George Bush to go to war. This unclassified version, Daniel, came to be known as the White Paper. And in this White Paper, the conclusion of U.S. intelligence that Hussein was not an imminent threat to the security of this country was completely deleted. Every single one of these all-important words was taken out, so Congress and the American people did not see this. And the question I ask of you is how evil, how perverse, how sick can George Bush and his people be? And yet they got away with all of this, at least up to now, and there are over 100,000 people being in their cold graves right now as I'm talking to you because of this. And when I testified before Congress, by the way, I had the documents in front of me, and I showed them to Congress. I said, this document here says such and such. This document here, the White Paper that you folks were given, certain things were deleted. And Lamar Smith, the ranking minority member from Texas, literally through John Conyers, the chairman, tried to shut me down. And at one point, it's been picked up on YouTube. I don't have a computer, but I understand it's out on YouTube. He said, if you don't stop him, I'm going to have, referring to himself, I'm going to have an aneurysm. Now, why was he saying this? Well, I'll tell you why, Dad. He was saying this because these people are more Republican than they are American.
Right.
But my appearance in front of Congress, not boasting, it just happens to be a fact, there were about 20 members on the panel there, and there was just silence when everyone was testifying, and I started testifying, and that 5 minutes there, at the end of it, there was a loud cheer in the gallery, and again, Smith tried to clear the gallery. Apparently, it's on YouTube. It's gotten over or close to 150,000 hits. So they're not interested in the truth, and the truth is that Bush took this nation to war under false pretenses. Why aren't they interested in the truth? Here's my sense of the right wing in America. Since Bush is a conservative Republican, and so are they, anything he does, anything at all, including murder, is just fine with them. Let me give you words from George Bush's own mouth that prove he knew he was lying when he told the American people that Hussein was an imminent threat to the security of this country. The date is January the 31st, 2003. Bush and British Prime Minister Tony Blair met in the Oval Office with 6 of their top aides, including Blair's chief foreign policy advisor, David Manning. After the meeting, Manning prepares a 5-page memo stamped extremely sensitive in which he summarizes what was said at the meeting. And in the memo, among other things, Manning says that Bush, not Blair, but Bush, was so worried about the failure of UN inspectors to find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq that he started talking about 3 possible ways to, quote, provoke a confrontation, unquote, with Hussein, one of which, Bush said, was to fly U-2 reconnaissance aircraft over Iraq, painted, obviously falsely, in United Nations colors. And Bush said if Hussein fires upon them, this will be a violation of UN resolutions, and this will justify our going to war. Now, Daniel, what we're talking about here is this. We have George Bush telling the American people, telling the world, that Hussein was an imminent threat to the security of this country, yet behind closed doors, this very small man was talking about how to provoke Hussein into a war.
Mm-hmm.
If George Bush honestly believed that Hussein was an imminent threat to the security of this country, which is the main reason he gave the American people for going to war, the thought, by definition, the thought of trying to provoke Hussein into a war would never, ever, ever have entered his mind. Now, there's much, much more evidence, but these are two of the key pieces of evidence showing that George Bush took this nation to war on a lie under false pretenses.
It's just really incredible to consider the fact that, that this has happened, and is there a possibility that we can actually change the course by, as you said earlier in the show, and as I've even suggested to people, let's just pretend for a minute that this is true, or let's know that it's true and that he can be persecuted. I think it sends an interesting... What's that?
Prosecuted.
Prosecuted. Yeah, I keep saying persecuted. I don't know why I keep thinking of the medieval times. Maybe because I feel like that's the times that we're in. It's anarchy. I don't know.
Well, Bush himself at one point said, if we find these people, we're going to persecute them.
Yeah, that's probably what it is. I got a Bushism on my tongue, and I can't seem to get rid of it.
Okay.
But the point is that the fact is that we would show to the world, in this country, nobody is above the law. This
Absolutely.
is a place this won't be tolerated. And I know that you also mentioned, too, or that you talked about in your book, and it's also a possibility that we feel that George Bush just does not like America.
Well, I mentioned that. I think the way I put it is not that he doesn't like America, but I don't think he has any particular love for America. Whether he dislikes it or hates it, I don't know. But I don't think he has any particular love for America, and I give several reasons for that, one of which, we don't have time to get into everything, but I work out of a converted stall in my office here in L.A. I've been married for over 50 years. On the 50th anniversary, my wife and I took off 3 days to go to the desert, and if it hadn't been the anniversary, we wouldn't have done that. I work 7 days a week, and I'm a complete cipher, actually. I don't have any authority at all. George Bush, the President of the United States, the most powerful man on earth, and I point out in the book, God, don't get old, David. Daniel. You forget numbers, but I think the number is, and it's in the book, that during the same period of time that I took 3 days off, George Bush took 903 days off on a vacation. Now, I got that figure from the CBS radio guy who covers the White House. 900 and some days he's either at his ranch in Crawford, Texas, or Camp David, or Kennebunkport, where the family compound is. Now, if you, let's not say you, let's take your neighbor or my neighbor who knows nothing about national affairs, international affairs, has no experience, and you appoint him President of the United States. If he loved America, what would he do? He'd knock himself out 7 days a week to try to become as knowledgeable as possible so he could lead this country in a way that it would improve the lives of all Americans and make the destiny of this country a better one than it seems to be going in the direction of. Instead, Bush goes in the opposite direction. And I say if you loved your country, you would do what I suggest this neighbor would do. Work as hard as possible. And yet Bush does the exact opposite thing. He's been having fun, joking, dancing, all types of other things. That's just one example that shows, in my mind, this guy has no particular love for his country. And by the way, and let's talk about the right wing again, and Bush falls into that area. I could give you many examples where they have no particular love for this country. When it was their time to fight for America, in the Vietnam War, what did these people do? Like Bush, Rove, Cheney, Limbaugh, they ran like hell in the opposite direction. And now they have no hesitancy in waving the flag and shedding the blood of other people's children in Iraq. But there's many, many things in the book. One chapter, which doesn't deal directly on Bush's guilt, is that he couldn't possibly be worse in his war on terrorism. The incompetence was staggering. It goes below F-, and yet if you listen to the Republicans, he's done a good job. He couldn't possibly be worse. And know that as a prosecutor, I never make an allegation like this without supporting it. You read that chapter, I hope.
Mm-hmm.
Did I meet my burden of proof that he could not possibly have been any worse?
Yeah, absolutely. As far as I've seen throughout the book, everything you've laid out, just, again, when I talk about the second Casualty of War, is common sense. There's plenty of it in the book, and that's what I'm getting at, is that if people take the time and the opportunity, and again, they'll find their blood kind of boiling a little bit to see that we have somehow allowed this to happen at the same time. But it's obvious that the country, especially in this election year, is saying, well, we don't want this to continue to happen again, but it would be encouraging, I think, for the people of this country to realize that we have more control over our government if we would just exercise that power through voting and getting involved, than believing that this power is just too overwhelming and there's nothing we can do. And certainly a book like The Prosecution, see, I got it right that time, I think the Bushism is leaving me, The Prosecution of George W. Bush, at least getting people to see and talk about the possibilities of reinstating democracy back into our country and making this nation, the United States of America, the great nation that it was and can be again. And
you articulated it very well. If we want this nation to become the great nation it once was, as you indicated, widely respected around the world, we can hardly do this if we're not willing to take the first step of bringing those responsible for the war in Iraq to justice. And we have to do that. As you know, since the Bush administration, for the first time in this nation's history, the majority of people in the Western world now look down negatively upon us. America no longer being the great nation that people throughout the world used to look up to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's all you can do is feel that there is an encouragement of change that is on the horizon here. And I know, and I just want to state this to our listeners because, you know, a lot of times you mentioned Rush Limbaugh, for instance, and you listen to that show and it irritates you just because of how far he leans without actually giving you any information at all. It's almost like watching a Fox News broadcast. They're telling you things that might happen, but they're not telling you what has happened. So journalism has certainly lost its footing in America big time, as we suggested even earlier in the program. Yeah. And that's a whole different story altogether. But I guess the point is that when it comes to this book, it isn't that we're trying to pick on George W. Bush. He just happens to be the man that took responsibility or decided to do something on a pretense and a lie to the country. And now most of America has come to realize we've been duped. This is ridiculous, and we want out of the war. And it's important to also note that if this was a Democrat who had pulled the same thing, just as you said in your book, I would be writing about them instead of George W. Bush, but it just happens to be George W. Bush who did this. And, you know, I just want to applaud you at least for having the courage to put something like that out there that is available mainstream from a guy who's very well respected in the publishing world, especially in the law community, the legal community, that is, for what you've done throughout your whole career, and let people know this isn't some guy that self-published some wacko book off the internet, but this is a real deal. And I would encourage people just to pick it up and read it because it's time that in America we need to start thinking again. And I think that's what we've lost the most is people just don't think anymore.
Yeah. They don't. They like to talk. They're very fond of talking, but they love to give their minds a rest. One point perhaps should be made to distinguish this book. For several years now, one revelation after another has come out, often accompanied by a book about the Bush administration's lies and deceptions in taking this nation to war in Iraq, from Curveball, the Niger incident, to revelation in a recent book that the White House ordered the CIA to forge a document linking Hussein to al-Qaeda. Now, while all of these revelations are very good, I'm not suggesting that they're not. They're very, very good. You have to know, Daniel, that they don't mean anything at all unless we do something about it. The revelations by themselves do not go anywhere. And that's why when people hear these revelations, they are prompted to ask, what now? Where do we go from here? This book The Prosecution of George W. Bush for Murder is the What Now, Where Do We Go From Here book, the only book out of the well over 100 books that have been written attacking Bush that provides a legal blueprint for bringing George Bush to justice for the murders of over 4,000 American soldiers. So what I want to say is that revelations come and go. People forget about them because there's no payoff. Bush, as with words critical of him, could hardly care less about these revelations because there's no actual harm to him. But I wonder, Daniel, if he'll still have that smirk on his face if he learns he could face the death penalty for his monumental crime. I'm very, very serious about this. I want you to know that I'm not taking this lightly. I'm looking for a prosecutor right now in this country to go after George Bush.
Well, it's, interesting to think of one's karma when you consider that as governor of Texas, if my recollection is right, is that he was also responsible for putting 150 people to death in his own state through the process of the death penalty. Now,
152 out of 152, that's right.
100, yeah, okay. It was about, I knew it was around 150.
Yeah, 152 death warrants. He signed off on all of them, including a young man who was mentally retarded, right?
So you realize now he's decided to do this to over 100,000 people in Iraq. He's done this with over 4,000 people of our own U.S. forces. It stands to reason it's about time somebody gets their foot put to the fire, and again, to show our country it's time to start thinking again, and start not only that, but electing good leaders that will lead us to where we were before, which is great prominence, and also encouragement for people around the world. And Vincent Bugliosi, it's been a pleasure to have you on our radio program today.
Well, Daniel, honored to be on the show. Thank you so very, very much. As I say, it's because of people like you that the prosecution of George W. Bush for murder is on the New York Times bestseller list. It's been on there. It's you and the word of mouth that has been given to this book. It's certainly, I can't thank at all the mainstream media. They've done everything possible to black out this book. I don't think there's any conspiracy there. Is that they all agree they don't want to talk about this book. They're terrified of it and staying away from it the way the devil stays away from holy water.
Well, and the fact is, too, is there are many great documentaries of which I've had the opportunity to see, and you come to understand the media is just powered by money, and you got to understand that if you do the right thing that brings enough of it in, that's the direction you're going to go. So they might even be doing you a favor. So
possibly, and if we have time, I just want to mention one very, very conservative Republican congressman from the South has heard the tape on this book, called me June 16th and said, Mr. Bugliosi, after the election, I'm going to be up front with you on this. You've proven that Bush took the nation to war on a lie. He misled Congress, and I want to be at your side if and when George Bush is prosecuted for first-degree murder. That's a very conservative Republican congressman from the South. He's buying copies of the book and handing it out to fellow colleagues, and it's been verified, telling them, read the book, we've been lied to.
Well, Vincent Bugliosi, please be in touch with that. Again, our show is Beyond 50. It's about getting past halfway thinking. In fact, it's about you getting to think, period, no matter what age. And again, it's been a pleasure to have you on our program today.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I
You bet.
appreciate it very much.
You bet. Again, the book is titled The Prosecution of George W. Bush for Murder, and our guest joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program, Vincent Bugliosi. It's been wonderful to talk with him. We also want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us here today on the Beyond 50 radio program. We do welcome your questions or comments. Just simply shoot me an email, Daniel@beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50 with a 50, nothing conspiratorial there, just a straightforward email with a question or a comment about our show. Also, sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter where you'll also catch that YouTube bit that Vincent was talking about earlier when he was in front of Congress, and that'll also be there along with the audio file as well. So to simply sign up for that newsletter, you just go to our website, beyond50radio.com, and that is the number 50 with a 50. We don't care if you're Republican. We don't care if you're Democrat. We just care that you do the right thing and that you think. And that's what our show is all about here. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us today. And remember, live your day past halfway.